Have you ever wondered if we could come up with a better definition of life, one that actually captures what life is? In this video, I continue on with Jaime Gomez Marquez's article, What is Life?, published in the 27 June 2021 edition of Molecular Biology Reports. The author considers other definitions of life that range from useless and machine-oriented to those that begin to bring in new and useful concepts, particularly information and complexity. At the end of this video, we return to the author's original 4 qualities of life and see if we can integrate newer concepts to create a more robust definition of what life is, or at least about what life involves. Learn more about Cesare Project at cesareproject.com. As we go into the introduction, the author talks about some of the other definitions of life. A reference to B. Clark comments that a definition of life is needed more than ever to provide defendable, objective criteria for searches of life on other planets. This is interesting to me because I'm coming from the standpoint as a physician wanting to understand life on this planet so we can heal people and resolve the disease. So this immediately is looking at the applications of life on other planets. As we look at this resource, we see that this was published in a handbook of astrobiology, which gives us the proper context to understand why we're trying to understand life elsewhere rather than on Earth here. Understanding life helps us recognize critical distinctions between machine life and robots, will provide insight into laboratory approaches to creating test tube life, to understand the origins of life, and clarify the central discipline of biology. Again, while not untrue, it's a different focus than mine, which is to understand disease and life here. This references another author, E. Kunin, about the challenges of defining life, that although life definitions are metaphysical rather than strictly scientific propositions, and I'm going to stop there. What we see here is, again, a bit of a disdain for the subjective nature of living systems, which are simply a fact. That we feel the need to separate them out and write them off and say that they're metaphysical or ideas and abstract concepts that sort of apply outside of our senses in a separate universe than strictly scientific propositions is very limiting. What we see here is simply mind-body dualism. Metaphysical is mind and strictly scientific is body. And that's a fundamental barrier in modern medicine, the inability to unify mind and body, which today is separated by far more than a hyphen. In this segment, What is Life?, the author goes on to look at some other definitions of life. A popular definition, quoted here from Wikipedia, defines life as a characteristic that distinguishes physical entities that have biological processes from those that do not. Again, who cares? We can all see that a rock is not like a rabbit. That's not particularly helpful. In reality, when we ask ourselves, what is life? We are asking, what are the characteristics that distinguish a living organism from a non-living entity? So again, that's that fundamental problem. You're just making an observation about the difference between two entities, but that doesn't necessarily provide any defining information that moves you toward understanding it better. You can look at a capital letter P and a capital letter R and recognize characteristics that make them different. You can say, aha, the R has an extra little line on it, but that has no meaning in terms of how the letters sound, where they fit in words and language and meaning. It's totally irrelevant. So simply observing a difference between the two entities does not make it meaningful, let alone answer probing questions about what, how, or why. Another interesting definition in here is from NASA, that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. That simply states that life is a chemical machine that has no operator or has somehow internalized the operator function that is capable of change. The operator function comes up again later, and it's an interesting one because when we think of machines, there's an on-off switch involved somewhere and somebody controls it. And in the case of machines, it's a person, not the machine itself. And actually, the idea that a machine can control its own on-off switch is extremely scary to people. So that's essentially what's happening here with life. It doesn't have an on-off switch that we control. It has internalized it quite miraculously. In another definition, life is a self-sufficient chemical system far from equilibrium, capable of processing, transforming, accumulating information acquired from the environment. So this gets a little more in depth. Again, we still see the chemical machine idea far from equilibrium. So that's talking about thermodynamic equilibrium, which means the system is dead. However, clearly biological systems do establish some type of equilibrium. Otherwise, I would not necessarily expect that I would continue into the future. There's some dynamic equilibrium that is happening that maintains systems for some unknown reason. This definition again gets back into observations of a different flavor that living systems can process information or metabolize information and interact with its environment. The useful tool here is information is an important element when we're talking about living systems. In another definition, we see the operator arrive again. Matter with the configuration of an operator, and that possesses a complexity equal to or even higher than the cellular operator. So just to be clear on the word operator, definitionally, it's a person who operates equipment or a machine, a person who runs a business, a person who acts in a specified way, a person. So it's interesting that here, that it has the configuration of an operator. So configuration has a very outside feel that it has somehow internalized. But now we see a new word, which is complexity, which is also a very useful and important term when understanding life. But here, it is limited to the cell as an operator or higher. So this acknowledges again that the cell is the smallest form of life, an idea that is over 350 years old. We get scared of the idea that, say, organelles, which are miniature organs inside a cell like ribosomes, mitochondria, nuclei, that they themselves could be living. In today's terminology, they're not. Somehow those elements come together to create a living cell, and that is the biggest barrier to understanding today. This section concludes with a quote from our Papa that says, "We may never agree on a definition of life, which will remain forever subject to a personal perspective." This quote nails one thing right on the head and gets one thing totally wrong. The thing that's totally wrong is we may never agree on a definition of life. That will only happen as long as we don't understand life. However, that life is in fact subject to a personal perspective is exactly true. So once we can start thinking about life from a personal perspective and understand that that's never going to be a purely objective process, then we can start to make some breakthroughs. The author goes on to discuss his definition of life. However, because I'm intrigued by his notion of the commandments of life and plan to do another video, I'm only going to hit some highlights here that captured my attention. Again, we see pre-programming. The author states, every living entity has a software, a pre-program, in its genetic material that contains the instruction manual necessary for both its construction and functioning. Furthermore, there is another pre-established program that conditions the vital phenomenon and that I have called the principle of inexorability. I was particularly intrigued by this. For now, there are some examples here, though I did not feel it did this concept any justice, so I leave it for a later talk. Here he addresses reproduction with the comment that we cannot predict the future because evolution is not a finalistic process. It is, to use the words of Jay Monod, the fruit of chance and necessity. This is another thing we see a lot in objective science. It is this notion of randomness, so chance and necessity. So things just happen kind of randomly, and yet they are necessary, which has a deterministic feel to it, and a bit of a hindsight understanding that is not present in a forward-moving system. I would say that evolution is more the fruit of choice or opportunity, possibility, though often we only want to apply those terms to people. This author tends to think of life as more of a process than a system. He goes on to provide 3 definitions of processes that are basically step-by-step series of gradual changes that result in an end. So right after a comment that evolution and presumably life is not finalistic is this idea of a process that does have a particular end. And while he does leave it open-ended, yes, we can't know where life is going, this feels a little contradictory to me. What is the difference between life, a living being, and a robot? Life is the vital process, and the living being is the system, the container, in a metaphorical way, where the vital process takes place. This is very much mind-body dualism, the idea that there's a vessel and a mind, a soul, a subjective element driving that vessel around. However, when we applied it to robots, it really is not so much the mind piece that creates problems, but that the robot isn't meeting the criteria or the characteristics of life for some reason. For example, that it's not organic or doesn't reproduce or evolve. The exception down here is xenobots, which are synthetic life forms that really seem to be muddying the water between robots and life. In conclusion, information and complexity have emerged as new concepts that are themselves kind of confusing in today's way of thinking about them. An objective interpretation, the one that science uses, tends to depend on processes, whereas information and complexity begin to bring in other elements that are not exactly process-driven. I return briefly to the author's 4 proposed characteristics of life. They include pre-programmed, interactive, adaptive, and evolutionary. What if pre-programmed is simply memory? When we think of memory as preceding communication and the ability to change, it fits a living system a lot better than pre-programmed, which creates problems of, well, who did the programming, where's the operator, and all of these other electronic concepts that don't marry in well with living systems. Memory, however, brings in information, complexity, and even a degree of a pre-programmed appeal that more logically ties into living systems' ability to communicate and change. The second term, interactive, takes on a technological appeal today. By simply changing this to the ability to communicate, we open the doors of possibility about how communication can occur, and it may not be across the electronic communication channels that we tend to think of today. Does that take us any further in understanding what life is? Perhaps not, but I think it gives us some new players to work with in understanding what life and disease ultimately is. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave your comments below. See you soon.